Like I mentioned before, Dr. Parvez was recently appointed to the Jacksonville Human Rights Commission, and although we're here to dispel all of the Islamophobia that's going on in this country tonight, I'd like to talk a little bit about the Human Rights Council, if it's okay, just for a minute. I've just got a couple of questions here. Number one, what are its goals?
Well, let me first thank you, Earl, and the First Coast Free Thought Society and the Unitarian Universalist Church for giving me this opportunity to have a conversation with you. I look forward to this evening, and I truly want to keep this as conversational as possible, which means I'll try to keep my responses as brief as possible. If you need more elaboration on any of my questions, feel free to ask follow-up questions, and I'll be more than happy to do that. In brief, the Human Rights Commission is a body that essentially...
Do we need more of those? Okay, is that better? For some of you it's better, for some of you it's not. My apologies.
There are some chairs over here, probably it's better.
Yeah, anyone who's having problems with the sun, there are plenty of chairs. There's about 6 here, and I see about 5 or 6 here, so feel free to move around. Oh, anyway, back to...
in brief, it's an agency that helps to resolve issues that are related to discrimination, racial tensions, tensions between different communities or different faith groups, through a process of education and also through a process of adjudication. It does have some authority to take action on certain matters of limited jurisdiction. It is a body that is required by the city to have. And it is also, particularly in this age of tough budgetary issues, many people do raise the question of, do we really need a Human Rights Commission? Is it redundant since we do have a state Human Rights Commission and we also have federal jurisdiction on many of these matters? And the short answer is yes, we do need a Human Rights Commission, partly because the city receives about $23 million of federal grants, which the city is likely to lose if it does not have a Human Rights Commission. So at the end of the day, the Human Rights Commission puts more money into the city coffers than it takes from it.
What role does the Human Rights Commission play in our lives?
Well, I think one of the most interesting things that the Human Rights Commission does, which is kind of like the effort that you are doing here tonight, which is it sponsors study circles. If you have not attended one of those, go to this website for the Human Rights Commission and enter your name to be a participant in its next study circle, or you can send an email to studycircles@coj.net, and they will put you on the list. And what it does is that it brings together a diverse group of people, and it discusses many of the issues that are related to matters of faith, matters of racial issues, discriminatory. So it tries to create a space for public dialogue. And through that, we can hopefully resolve many of our differences. Does not mean we'll come to an agreement on everything that we discuss, but certainly we will have a better perspective and understanding of things where we may not have a similar worldview or a similar viewpoint.
You mentioned dialogue, and I wanted to have a dialogue tonight about Islam, and I'm really thankful that you accepted our invitation to be here tonight. This is part of the Building Bridges Beyone Belief campaign for the First Coast Free Thought Society. And in a nutshell, I believe that dialogue is a good thing, that we can talk, discuss our what we have in common, discuss differences that we may need to resolve, and get people educated about different worldviews. I've had people come up to me and say, well, why do you want to have people from different faiths come in and talk about their faith? Well, I believe it's necessary. I believe that fear and not being educated about different worldviews is causing a lot of the problems between people being able to get along with each other that have differing worldviews. So that's the reason we want to do this, and we're going to keep doing this into the future in 2011. I want to read something that we received just the other day because you mentioned dialogue, and I'm a big fan of having these types of dialogues. Someone emailed the First Coast Free Thought Society. They're very concerned about Sharia, and this gentleman said, we must understand what we are up against, not simply hope that dialogue and engagement will make the challenge go away. I'm a big proponent of dialogue. I think that dialogue will be a component of making problems go away. What do you think?
Well, dialogue is certainly a far better option to resolve conflicts than the alternative. So wherever and whenever we get an opportunity, we should welcome that. I think many of the problems that we are facing today when it relates to global conflicts are not only a result of just our poor understanding of a different culture and a different society, but it also stems from many of our policy blunders that we keep making over and over and over again. There is an interesting book that came out recently by Graham Fuller. And if you do not know who Graham Fuller is, he is a former CIA analyst, long-time CIA career officer. He wrote a book, and the title of the book is quite provocative, but very interesting. He says, "A World Without Islam." That's the title of his book. A world without Islam. What would this world be if there was no Islam? And his conclusion was, we would still be in the Middle East. We will still be fighting for oil. Because our entanglement, and by our he particularly means the West's, entanglement with the Middle East predates Islam. And it has almost nothing to do with religion. Does not mean that religion is not an important contributor and not an important aspect of how societies have evolved, people's worldviews have evolved. But since much of our focus about Islam and Muslims stems from a conflict-ridden viewpoint, he really makes a very good intellectual argument on that none of these issues, none of our conflicts with the world of Islam or the Muslim world are a result of religion. They are a result of many different factors, primarily political and economic. And that's his conclusion, that even without the world of Islam, we would still be in Iraq and we'll still be in Afghanistan.
Well, you mentioned religion, and when I hear people talk about religion, I get a little bit confused. I hear people say religion is good, religion is bad, religion is this, religion is that. But we all know, I know, that there are different varieties of religion. You know, there's different denominations within Christianity, there are different, 1,000 different religions in general. And they all have different elements, conservative elements, orthodox, moderates, liberals, progressives. Do you think Islam is the same way?
Yeah, I mean, religion is first and foremost a human endeavor. Like any human endeavor, it has its moments of success and its moments of failures. So thus, with any human endeavor, anytime you get, the way I often explain it even to my own children about these issues, I said, we as a family, we don't agree on everything. So why do you expect people from different backgrounds, different upbringings, different educational background, different economic background, even if they worship in a similar way, even if that's their common cause, why do you expect them to agree on everything? So the fact that religious groups have divisions, and within divisions, more divisions and subdivisions, is not surprising to me.
Well, I bring this up because when you listen to the radio or watch television, you see all these talking head shows, and you see these representatives from Islam, from different religions, and when the show's over, you're left with coming to the conclusion that this particular talking head represents all of Islam, which I know you know that's not true. How do we know? How does the general public know who to believe? How do we know who represents Islam?
Well, the answer is nobody and everybody. First of all, why nobody? Because in Islam there is no pope. There is, at least definitely in the Sunni sect of Islam, there is no pope. In the Shia sect, which represents about 15% of the Muslim world, there is something that is akin, but even then it is not quite there yet. So there is no central authority in Islam that speaks for all the faithful. So in that sense, nobody represents Islam. In a sense, everybody represents Islam, because once somebody claims that I am a Muslim, then they have to at least have a sense that they are a representative of their faith. Just like we as Americans, when we travel abroad, even though we don't represent America, we are representing America. Every time we come in contact with somebody, that may be their only contact with an American. Any one of us who have traveled abroad, we have encountered this so many times. I just came back, as you mentioned, from a Fulbright endeavor in Bangladesh, and stayed there for 5 months, taught, and traveled across not only Bangladesh, but across the Indian subcontinent. And in many instances, people that I met, that was their only contact with an American. The only time they heard an American viewpoint. So what I say, although I was not, even though I was on a State Department grant, I was not an official representative of the US government. And yet, in some sense, I represented America. So it is both in some sense.
Yeah, and to me, it's really troubling. The general sense that I get from just being out on the streets would be like for atheism. A lot of people think that atheists and agnostics are Satanists. And I'm thinking, let's see, I don't believe in Satan. The Christian community are the ones who believe in Satan. And with Islam, the Islamophobia has everyone, not perhaps everyone, but a lot of people, a lot of Americans are thinking that Islam, everyone who subscribes to Islam is probably a terrorist or supporting a terrorist organization. And what do we do? Who do we tap into? How do we tap into the conservatives and the Orthodox, or do we leave them alone? Do we target the moderates to come out and saturate the airwaves? Any advice on that?
I think you have to talk to everybody, because first of all, these labels, I personally don't subscribe to many of these labels, or prescribe to these labels, or prescribe these labels upon people, because human beings are complex. In many instances, a person could be a conservative and a liberal at the same time. They may have conservative views on certain issues and may have very liberal views on certain issues. And certainly when it comes to faith, the matter gets even more complicated. It is not uncommon, and I'll give this as an example. Today's Turkey is a secular, and some may say even militantly secular democracy in the heart of what is considered the greater Middle East. And some consider that as an anomaly in the Muslim world. And to some extent it may be. But the Turkish government today is led by a party and a leader that is often described as an Islamist. Some people put the adjective moderate Islamist. And the secular forces in Turkey often and do oppose this leadership. Now, based on labels of an Islamist and a secularist, which group do you think is more supportive of Turkey joining the European Union? The answer is Islamist. Which group do you think is more protective of minority rights in Turkey? The Islamist. The answer is Islamist. Which group do you think has spoken out most vociferously against anti-Semitism in parts of the Muslim world, particularly in Turkey? The Islamist leader. So there goes our definitions. There goes our stereotypes.
And there goes the secularists under the bus. And why is that? Why I would have guessed secularists for every answer.
The answer is that there is a misunderstanding that people believing in Islam or practicing Islam are anti-democratic, anti-liberal rights, anti-peace. These are the stereotypes. But if one studies both the history of Islam and particularly the normative teachings of Islam, one would find that Islam, from a very early point in its history, emphasized the idea of respect for human life. And in fact, one of the more important verses in the Quran, which is the holy book of the Muslims, says, and I'm paraphrasing, that anyone who saves a life, it is akin, his reward, his or her reward, is akin to saving of all humanity. And anyone who takes a life, his punishment, his or her punishment, is akin to the punishment of killing all humanity. So that's preservation, that's the right to life. That's the preservation of life, the sanctity of life. Our view, particularly from the Western context, is that the first constitution in the world was the Magna Carta. But the first constitution of the world was drafted when Prophet Muhammad migrated from Mecca to Medina, and it's called the Charter of Medina, or the Constitution of Medina. You can Google that and read about the Charter of Medina. And if you read that, it was first a constitution, an agreement between Muhammad, then acting as the head of a state, and all of the tribes, which would be kind of like all of the people or all of the states within, and that was an early example of federalism. And within that constitution, there was guarantee for religious rights of minorities. It talked about that Jews and Christians or people of other faith would not only be free to live within the state, but they will conduct their affairs according to the rules of their own religion. Thinking now, it does not appear as a grand idea, but think about this as an idea 14 centuries ago. In a part of the world that had not seen a lot of cultural interactions. Mecca and Medina are in modern-day Saudi Arabia. It is not in Anatolia. It is not in Mesopotamia, which had already seen previous civilizations and had been the crossroads of previous civilization. So from that perspective, Islam gave a progressive vision of, within its context, gave a progressive vision towards minority rights, preservation of life. And you talked about Sharia. Sharia, the word which has suddenly become, I heard Newt Gingrich the other day said that the US government should ban Sharia law. First of all, I do not know how you do that. But second, is that he does not even know what he's talking about, which is not surprising, knowing Newt.
Watch out.
But most people don't understand that the word Sharia simply means a pathway. And some people may even say that Sharia law is a misnomer.
It's called a pathway to the water hole, isn't it?
It's pathway to a water hole,
yeah.
Which means pathway to life. And Sharia consists of, in a literal sense, Sharia, not a literal sense, in a practical sense, what Sharia means, it consists of the Quran, which is the foundational text of Islam, which Muslims believe is the word of God, revealed to Prophet Muhammad by Angel Gabriel. And it consists of the hadith, which are the sayings of Prophet Muhammad, his sayings, his approvals, or his actions that his companions observed and they wrote it down. So those two foundational texts form Sharia. How do you ban that? Banning Sharia would be saying like outlaw the Quran in the US. And certainly nobody would accept that. Or I shouldn't say nobody, but now seeing the New York mosque controversy, who knows where we stand on some of these issues now.
Well, the people who are opposed to Sharia are watching videos that are circulating the internet where women are being stoned to death for various crimes. So if you want to enlighten us on that variety.
That's again, this is precisely where the problem lies, is that we have used exceptions to judge the norm.
Oh, I agree.
And does stoning to women happen in some contemporary Muslim societies? The answer is yes, and we just saw an example in Iran. But is it a rare exception? And the answer is yes. In the few instances it happened, it made headline news. And even then there was an outcry not only from people in the West, but also from many Muslims.
Right. Well, we have examples in this country of similar occurrences. Matthew Shepard. Anyone know who Matthew Shepard was? Okay, beaten and hung on a fence, all because he was a homosexual. So this country is not immune to this type of thing.
And sometimes, we are very quick to judge others, but it's not that we are guilty-free when it comes to cruel and unusual punishment. Many of the methods by which we carry out some of our death sentences today in the name of the state. Certainly nobody, in a rational mind, nobody would say, well, that's not cruel. That is not cruel and unusual. Just the other day, I was listening to NPR and they were talking about some of the, medicines or chemicals that are used in these lethal injections and how it actually does not, and it does cause pain. So part of it is the human evolution. Certainly the way we, personally I'm not in favor of the death penalty, but certainly the way we do carry out death penalty today is an improvement on how it was carried out certainly 50 years ago, 100 years ago. Mm-hmm. And that's the way we have to look at the evolution of other societies. Many Muslim majority countries around the world today are in terms of their societal evolution where we were maybe a couple of 100 years ago. Mm-hmm. So it took us a while to get to where we are, and we grew up when the attention of the world was not on us. Not everything that we did was on the internet and analyzed and scrutinized and vilified. Unfortunately, what happens in other parts of the world immediately makes headlines and makes us feel that as if that's the norm in the society, when those are the exceptions in the society. Right,
and you can't really shame people too much when they see CNN run a clip of a mob wanting to stone someone and call it Sharia law. This person watching this television show has nothing else to go on, perhaps.
No, I'm not playing the blame game over
I know
here.
You're not.
And I don't fault people for coming to erroneous conclusions on this, because if that's all they're watching, if somebody listens to Fox News, then I would not be surprised that they would think that Obama is a socialist, because that's all you hear.
Well, we're not getting much. Even not just Fox News, but NPR, CNN, we're not getting enough coverage of the different varieties. When you hear about Sharia on the news, it doesn't matter whether it's Fox or NPR, it's always the same thing. They're showing us the worst, the most hideous part of it.
Right. And if you look at the current discourse over the mosque controversy in New York, one of the good aspects of that controversy was that some media did try to present a face of the Muslim community in their news shows, particularly MSNBC, particularly Keith Olbermann and others. In their efforts, they did try to present a different viewpoint. I do not know if you saw one of his shows where he showed a story of a church in Tennessee that where a mosque was going to be constructed right next to the church, and when the church heard about that, they put up a sign in front of their church saying, I think it's called the Heartsong Church. Heartsong Church welcomes their Muslim neighbors. And then they allowed the Muslim neighbors to worship in the church while their mosque was being constructed. And
that's truly interfaith.
That's truly interfaith, but that's not as exceptional as many think about it. Many people around the country perhaps heard such a cooperation for the first time, but it is not as exceptional. It happens in our own city. In the Islamic Center, which is on St. John's Bluff, right opposite the Islamic Center is a church. And when I first moved to Jacksonville, the Islamic Center did not have much of a parking space. And the church would allow us to park
across the street
and then walk over.
Yeah, I remember seeing that.
And right now in Orange Park, a group of Muslims are trying to construct a new mosque in Orange Park. And while they're in between the construction, they're utilizing a church that is allowing them to come and conduct their Friday worship services in the church. So unfortunately, we don't hear about these stories, or rarely hear about these stories. So sometimes there's a disconnect between how things are actually happening at the grassroots level versus how the media portrays it. But in fairness, sometimes the media does get it right. You know, in my own personal situation here in Jacksonville, when the controversy erupted about my nomination, by and large, the media in Jacksonville did get it right. They, by and large, did not over-sensationalize the story. By and large, they gave an opportunity to get the truth out, particularly our newspaper, which wrote an editorial after they had a 3-hour meeting. They did not rely on all of the stuff that was floating around in the blogosphere to arrive at their opinion. They actually met, discussed, we had a full discussion, and then after that, they endorsed my nomination to the Human Rights Commission. So sometimes the media does get it right.
I agree. Sometimes they do. I want to take you to task on what you said about you don't like these adjectives like conservative, orthodox, moderate, liberal, progressive. How are we going to know who stands for what if we don't use these adjectives, especially the large number of moderates that we have that are really going to break everything down to where people can understand it? The moderates are going to lead us into this realm of the tipping point where the bad stuff, the Islamophobia goes away. I really believe that, the moderates. So if a person doesn't label themselves as a moderate, what does that person do?
I understand the difficulty of this, and maybe there is a room for utilizing that label, and I'm not completely opposed to it, but I personally don't like to do it. But where I do find it even less applicable, less useful, is when it is applied to many Muslims. Does not mean that the label moderate and conservative is completely inapplicable in a Muslim context. But the problem with the definition of moderate and conservative about Muslims is partly dependent upon how we want to view the Muslims in the context of our political views. In other words, we are not saying a Muslim is a conservative or moderate having been aware of or knowledgeable of the theology of Islam. Our view of a moderate or conservative is, are they against us or for us? If they're for us, then they're moderates. If they're against us, then they must be extremists. You know, and the example of that I give is during the Cold War, after the fall of the Soviet Empire, after the Russians retreated from Afghanistan, the Mujahideen in Afghanistan were welcomed by Ronald Reagan in the lawns of the White House, and they were compared to our founding fathers. At that time, the Mujahideen were for us. They were moderates. They were patriots. They were stalwarts compared to our founding fathers. A few years later, we were dropping bombs on them. Now they were the extremists. So again, where we stand on a political conflict has defined, and there's a great book. If you want to learn more about how our definitions of a moderate Muslim or a conservative Muslim has shifted, partly because we really do not understand Islam or the Muslims. So we are labeling them based on our political convenience, not really based on our understanding from inside the faith, How would a Muslim define somebody as a moderate or a conservative? And the book that I would recommend to you is, the title of the book is Good Muslim, Bad Muslim, by Professor Mahmoud Mamdani from Columbia University. It's a great book where he traces the history of how our definitions of a good Muslim or a bad Muslim, which is sometimes serves as a proxy for conservative or moderates or liberals or whatever.
Well, I'm a big fan of labels, but I don't know if I like that good, bad. That's us, them.
Well, that's how it, a few years ago, I would say maybe 4 or 5 years ago, maybe a little bit more than that, Rand Corporation did a study, did a report, where they said, we need to divide the Muslims into these categories. And they gave 5 or 6 categories. And we should not work with the 5 of the 6 categories or 6 of the 7 categories. We should only work with this category. When most Muslims who looked at that report said, that's not how the Muslim community is organized. There are groupings within the Muslim community, but that's not the grouping. And certainly saying that you work with one and do not work with 6 out of the 7 or 5 out of the 6 is actually counterproductive. Because at the end of the day, this is the whole problem that I often have with our postures in international diplomacy when we say, we're not talking to that group of people or that country or that regime or that leader. Well, the whole point of diplomacy is talk to people who are knuckleheads. If you're talking to friends, then why do we need diplomats? Everybody can talk to a friend. The art of diplomacy is getting somebody to a point where they may not necessarily arrive at that point on their own cognition, but you persuade them to get to that point.
Well, I like your label, knuckleheads. I still think labels are important, especially the example you gave where you were talking about the Turkish government and the secularists and the Islamists,
right,
and who's better serving the populace. And I think there are other examples that apply. If I'm listening to the radio and I hear someone talking about an extremist or a moderate, I have a better idea of what's going on compared to those two individuals being introduced as Islamists. Do I not?
Maybe. My view is that let's listen to the arguments. Sometimes when we apply a label, then we automatically prejudge. Then anything that comes after that, we already have prejudged their viewpoint. Instead of applying the label, let's hear their viewpoint, and most of us will be able to discern from that viewpoint if they're moderates or liberals or progressives or extremists.
Okay, well, I have a question here that is relevant to what we're talking about. It concerns terrorism. Is it unfair for the news media to label some terrorists as Islamic terrorists? Have you heard that term before on the news? Plenty of times. And every time I hear it, I just have to roll my eyes. It's like, Islamic terrorist? This person is a terrorist first. This person might claim to be a Muslim, but so what? We've got Christian terrorists in this country, and I never hear them say a Christian terrorist.
Right, there is another book I would recommend. Professor, what else would a professor do? There is a book written by a gentleman named Robert Pape. He's from the University of Chicago. The name of the book is Dying to Win. I think the subtitle is The Strategic Logic of Suicide Terrorism. It is the first study, and may be the only empirical study till date on the logic, empirically studying suicide terrorism for the last 20 years. So actually data-driven research, looking at all of the incidents of suicide terrorism that has happened and trying to empirically study, using rigorous academic standards, what were the driving factors behind that. And let me quote from that book a little bit. Perhaps it will answer that question. So, hold on. Lost my book.
While you're looking
okay, here
for
it is.
that, oh, okay.
So he says that Pape contends that linking Islam, or specifically Islamic fundamentalism, to terrorism is misleading. He writes, and I quote, "Only a tiny fraction of those who subscribe to these movements have engaged in acts of violence. And he goes on to say that there is no link between religion and terrorism. There is virtually no link. Religion may be a factor, but if it is, it's a very small factor. And he concludes that the motive behind suicide terrorist attacks, not just by Muslims, but by many other groups and ideologies and people, the motivating factor has often been foreign occupation. Once the foreign occupation has been removed, terrorism has almost gone down, sometimes almost instantaneously, or very quickly. So there is no link between religion and suicide terrorism. Actually, Pape and I were co-panelists at a conference, and I have corresponded with him on a variety of work. I have written a paper that quotes him extensively in my paper, and the title of my paper is Terror in the Name of Islam, Unholy War, Not Jihad. It's published by the Case Western Reserve of Law. And my conclusion, again, essentially arrived at the same thing. And part of my paper came from a more empirical point of view, looking at the actual data of suicide terrorism and trying to look at what motivated them. And I approached it not so much from the data, because I didn't have access to the data he had. He had a Department of Defense grant to do his study. And I approached it more from an Islamic textual perspective, looking at the sacred texts, looking at the arguments. What do the sacred texts actually tell us about issues of violence and terrorism? And there is not a single verse that talks about committing terrorism, killing innocent people. There is not any textual justification, religious justification to the killing of innocent. And I'll quote this from you, from some of the this is a statement that was released by all of the major American Muslim groups a couple of days after 9/11. And there are many texts that I can quote, but I think this is brief, and it will probably make the point very clearly. And their statement was, "We condemn in the strongest possible terms what are apparently vicious and cowardly acts of terrorism against innocent civilians. We join with all Americans in calling for the swift apprehension and punishment of the perpetrators. No cause could ever be assisted by such immoral acts. All members of the Muslim community are asked to offer whatever help they can to the victims and their families. Muslim medical professionals should go to the scenes of the attack to offer aid and comfort to the victims." Then at another time, after another attack, terrorist attack, these groups again came together and issued another statement that made it even more clear. It said, "Islam strictly condemns religious extremism and the use of violence against innocent lives. There is no justification in Islam for extremism or terrorism. Targeting civilians, life and property through suicide bombing or any other method of attack is forbidden. And those who commit these barbaric acts are criminals, not martyrs. In the light of the teachings of the Quran and the Sunnah, which means the teachings of the Prophet, we clearly and strongly state all acts of terrorism targeting civilians are forbidden in Islam. It is forbidden for a Muslim to cooperate with any individual or group that is involved in any act of terrorism or violence. And it is the civic and religious duty of Muslims to cooperate with law enforcement authorities to protect the lives of civilians. We issue this fatwa following the guidance of our scripture, the Quran, and the teachings of our Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him."
Well, you mentioned fatwa. Could you explain that a little bit?
Fatwa simply means a religious edict. Fatwas are non-binding religious edicts because there is no pope in Islam, as I mentioned. So nobody can promulgate an opinion and everybody has to follow that. A fatwa usually is any scholar who has gone through some aspect of formal religious training would be qualified to give fatwas. And certainly Osama bin Laden does not qualify, even beside the fact that what he says is just patently idiotic. Does not have the requisite credentials to issue a fatwa. And a fatwa is, as I mentioned, the simplest definition is it's a non-binding religious opinion on any matter. Fatwas, if you go to Al-Azhar University in Cairo, which is often regarded as the highest seat of learning in Sunni Islam, in Al-Azhar, they probably issue 1,000 fatwas every day. There's a committee that sits there. You go up to say, you know what, I have a property next door to a church and I want to buy that, or I want to buy a church and convert that into a mosque. Am I allowed to do that? If that's the question somebody asks. Somebody maybe has that situation. Or can I make a kidney donation to my neighbor who is a Christian? Am I allowed to do that in Islam? Or am I allowed to donate kidneys, period? A scholar would have to evaluate that and say, yeah, according to his opinion, Islam allows you that or does not allow you that. Having heard that opinion, you are under no obligation to follow that. So people who ask for fatwa are often doing this, often to satisfy their, I often say people fatwa shop. Which means they will go from scholar to scholar to scholar until they hear one scholar that gives an opinion that they agree with, and they say, I found my fatwa. I'm doing this because I heard that fatwa. But what about the 10 others who said not to do that? He says, no, they don't count. I found it. I found what I was looking for. So often, and in some sense, fatwas have been somewhat trivialized by Muslims themselves. And well, playing with religion is dangerous. Playing with anything is dangerous. But sometimes people have abused that, and sometimes clerics have abused that authority. Like Khomeini when he issued the fatwa on Salman Rushdie. Yeah, it's not that clerics have not abused their positions of authority, but the most important thing to realize is these are non-binding opinions. Like this opinion was given by a group of American Muslim scholars based on their understanding. They came together, they studied the issue, they drew from their understanding of their religion, and they came to this opinion. This opinion was given addressing all Muslims, but particularly Muslims in America, because that was the context in which they gave that fatwa. Now, here was a Muslim in Fort Hood who shot his fellow American soldiers. He essentially ignored this. He says, you know what, that doesn't agree with my viewpoint. What can you do about that? You can't do. There is nothing within Islamic authority, within religious authority that can address that.
And the question that comes to my mind with this part of the discussion has to do with whether or not religion creates hate and discord towards certain groups, and they use human beings as a means to carry out their ends, or do we flip it and say people are using religion to justify their hate and discontent with certain issues, certain things? Do you think it's a little bit of both? What do you think?
Well, as I said, religion is a human endeavor. It has been used as a source. It has been a motivating factor for many great acts. Mother Teresa did her work in my city where I grew up, where I was born in Calcutta, based on her motivations of faith. And religion has been used to do great good. Religion has been used to commit acts of terrorism like Osama bin Laden has done. And those examples exist in every faith. The good and the bad exists in every faith. No faith is exempt. And many of you may not like me saying this, and so are the secularists, right? So are the people of no faith. The word terrorism, I do not know how many of you know this, the modern usage of, the first use of the word terrorist comes from the French Revolution. And the history of terrorism, if you go back, it goes back all the way to the Roman civilization, even from a historical perspective, if you read some of the books that have been written on the history of terrorism. But certainly in the modern day context, the history of terrorism begins with the French Revolution. And both sides of the revolution committed acts of terrorism. And that was what, a secular endeavor? Or a non-religious endeavor?
Well, yeah, we'll say non-religious. And secularists have their poster children, Joseph Stalin being a good example. You mentioned that fatwa can be ignored.
It can be.
Okay. And you mentioned the one with Salman Rushdie.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm a big fan of Cat Stevens. And I just love his music. Well, he's not Cat Stevens anymore. Now he's Yusuf Islam, I believe. Are you familiar with his troubles with that fatwa with Salman Rushdie? Mm-hmm. I didn't know anything about it, and I was reading Christopher Hitchens' article in Vanity Fair, and he mentioned Cat Stevens was supportive of that fatwa, and it just, I just literally just had to sit down for a minute. I was like, what? My hero is in trouble here? And then so I actually Googled it. I went on the internet and started looking up this stuff because I was like, Christopher Hitchens has to be wrong here. And I saw where he had mentioned that, well, this is Islamic law. You can't blaspheme someone, or you can't blaspheme Islam. And I'm thinking, well, this fits into religion, creating hate and discord versus people doing it and using religion. When you have these religious leaders doing it, what do we do? Do we tap into the moderates to speak out against it? I know this is, maybe I've asked this question tonight already again, but...
I think you tap into good people and you continue with the process of dialogue. I think instead of, my, again, viewpoint is instead of labeling people and saying that I can talk to this group of people and not talk to them, have a kind of what you started with, the dialogue that you and I participated in with the First Baptist Church people. Based on labels or based on even some of the views that I know are part of the First Baptist group, maybe my first instinct was, what's my point of debate talking with them? And
that was my first instinct.
Yeah, it was my first instinct was that, I know some of the viewpoints that came from some of the leadership within the First Baptist Church, and I also know that among the people who were the most vocal in their opposition to my nomination to the Human Rights Commission were also members of the First Baptist Church.
Right, and that's why I said that was my first instinct.
Right.
But after that meeting that we had,
right,
I've changed my mind.
Exactly.
And
so based on labels, we would have avoided dialogue. But I think certainly I'm better off having spoken to them. I do not know, you can ask them if our dialogue actually reshaped perceptions. But certainly it gave me an opportunity to address some of their profoundly misconstrued opinions.
Right, and it looked more like curiosity than anything to me. I was feeling uncomfortable when we had that talk, but it's worth it. The dialogue is where we need to go. We can't depend on NPR and CNN and I hate to say it, WOKV. We've got to get together in the community and have these dialogues and discuss what Islam is, what atheism is, what it is not, and then everyone here in the audience goes home and you discuss this with your social circle, and we've got 100, maybe 120 people here tonight. Once you go home and share everything you've heard tonight, then your social circle, 6, 10, 20, 30 people, we've done a big job here by having this dialogue. I wanted to ask, you mentioned New York City, and I want to talk a little bit because I want us to have a Q&A tonight. I want the audience to be able to ask questions because I know they've probably got 1,000 for you and maybe 3 or 4 for me. And that's good because that's why Dr. Ahmed is here tonight. But I want to talk about New York City Ground Zero Islamic Community Center, if that's okay. I've heard a lot of, and I'm sorry, we're having a label war here tonight. I've heard a lot of moderate Muslims who are saying, well, maybe it's a bad idea. Maybe we should consider not building the center 2 blocks from this quote-unquote ground zero. What's your opinion on that? Do you think that this is a bad time, and is there ever going to be a good time? I mean, what is your opinion on whether or not this center should be built?
Well, I've written quite a few articles on it.
Yeah, I know, but not everybody in the audience has
Right.
read them, so.
Right, so they are on a Huffington Post. You can go to my blog and read them. My blog is drparvezahmed, so Dr. Parvez Ahmed .blogspot.com. And my opinion on this is that, first of all, with kind of paraphrasing President Obama's opinion, if a church has the right to build on that center, if a synagogue has a right to build on that center, then a mosque has a right to be built on that center. And so in short, and allow me to be a little bit provocative, when it comes to issues of fundamental rights, they should not be subject to public opinion, because we live in a republic. We cannot subjugate our constitution to public opinion. Then we lose the meaning of that constitution. Then we become like any other country. What makes us special, what makes us different, is that we have a constitution that protects the rights of everybody. When we have such periods of differences and differences in opinion, we resolve our differences through our unqualified support for our constitution. And constitutionally, there is no argument against the mosque. Now it comes to matters of practical issues. So first of all, the people who raised objection about that mosque, if those objections came only from the 911 families, then I think the issue would have had a chance of a more amicable resolution. But the problem arose because Islamophobes, people who are anti-Muslim, they will oppose anything that is Muslim. They're opposing mosques in Tennessee and California.
So does that mean that the Islamophobes are saying that Islam destroyed the
That's what
World
their
Trade
argument
Center?
is, that their argument is that we cannot have a mosque there because Islam destroyed the 911
When in fact, it
the
was
World
just
Tower.
people.
It was just people that destroyed it, and people whose actions were condemned by the Muslim community universally. I do not know of a single Muslim mainstream credible leader, political or religious, who did not condemn 911. After 911, you should have read some of the headlines across the Muslim world. The papers, the editorials, the religious leaders, and everybody was in solidarity with America. We had friends all over the world, including in countries that are considered our enemies, like Iran. In fact, the president of Iran was probably the first Muslim country who called the White House that day. Was the first Muslim leader, if I remember correctly. So that's one of the arguments. Now, how do you resolve this issue? My opinion, as I wrote this in the Florida Times-Union, is that I would argue to the builders of this mosque, the group that is putting this mosque together, this community center together, to move this mosque. Not because they don't have a right to do it, actually they do have a right to do it. And if people are offended by it, I don't care about that. If we subjected these issues to popular opinion and people's offenses, we would not have integrated the army, and we would not have desegregated our schools, because people were offended by those too. So that's not the argument over here. People's offense, people hurt feeling. Somebody asked me today about another controversial subject, and I said, don't worry about offending me, because this is first and foremost a matter of the Constitution. If the Constitution agrees with that, then I'm for it. Whether it offends me personally or not should not be a concern to you. I'm an adult, I can suck it up. And so that's the crux of the matter. Now, why do I say they should move? Or they should at least consider moving or doing something different? The reason I say this is that the mission of this group, and I studied this issue, and I came to this conclusion that the mission of this group that wants to put this Islamic Center together is to create dialogue, is to promote harmony, is to promote civility, civil discourse. In this context, if they insist on staying there or do not address this issue, it would become very difficult for them. I'm not saying impossible, maybe there is a way out, but at least from where I see it, is that it would become very difficult for them to actually be successful in that mission. So it would be, and I wrote this in the context of an Islamic perspective. Since this is an Islamic group, this is a group of imams that are putting it together, I argued it from Islamic text, actually, that why they should consider moving. I'll tell you the story. And that will perhaps illustrate why I arrived at this viewpoint. Prophet Muhammad, after he migrated from Mecca to Medina, he was born in Mecca, he started his mission in Mecca. After 13 years of preaching and persecution and his family being killed and his friends being killed, he moved. He was ordered by God to migrate from Mecca to Medina, and that's where he established the Islamic State. So after a few years of that establishment, he wanted to go back to Mecca for a pilgrimage. It was the norm of the society at that time that during the month of pilgrimage, anybody could come to Mecca. Anybody. Doesn't matter whether they're Christian, Jews, pagans, no faith, doesn't matter. Everybody had the right to that sanctuary that is now Kaaba, the black stone that you see in Mecca. Everybody had right to that. So Prophet Muhammad gathered his companions and they marched towards Mecca with no arms, because this was the pilgrimage season. As they came towards the holy precincts of that city, the Meccans who were controlling the city at that time, they were not Muslims. They were opposed to Islam. That's why they drove him out. They met him at the gates and they said, "You cannot go in." And he said, "Why?" "Because this is the custom. You cannot prevent me." So based on that environment, he had a right to go in to that precinct and conduct his pilgrimage. Nobody could stop him. Legally, morally, he had the right to do that. And they said, "No, because there was enmity between him and his followers and the Meccans." They started negotiating what could be a resolution. So the resolution came that he entered into a treaty. That treaty is called the Treaty of Hudaybiyah. You can Google this and read upon it. This is one of the most seminal events in Islamic history. He entered into a treaty with the Meccans saying that, if I remember correctly, for the next 10 years, we will not do this. We will not come back. And for the next 10 years, you will not attack us. So he signed a treaty of peace. Now, as he was signing that treaty, because he was unlettered, he could not read or write, his companions drafted the document, and both sides were going to sign the document. So his companions were writing it, so at the bottom of his name, they wrote, "Muhammad, the Prophet of God." And the Meccans said, "We can't agree to that. Because if we knew you were the Prophet of God, why would we oppose you?" So he ordered his companions, so Prophet Muhammad ordered his companions to say, strike it out, just scratch out the Prophet of God. And his companion says, "We can't do that, because we believe you are the Prophet of God. Why would we strike it out?" So he asked his companions, "Show me in the letter where it says Prophet of God." And they showed it to him. He took up the pen and he scratched it out. And then he signed the treaty.
So they were having problems with labels.
So he showed that, and that's what I wrote in my article, that sometimes, not in every context, but in some context, and I believe this is one of those contexts, an imperfect peace is better than a righteous conflict. And I think this is one of those instances of that.
Okay, I have to respectfully disagree. I think that if we don't build the center where they want to build it, we're giving in to the Islamophobia. How are we going to heal? The Building Bridges project is part of the interfaith work that's going on all over this nation. And if we're going to do interfaith work, we're going to have an interfaith environment. And if we don't build that center, where's the interfaith environment? Where's the interfaith work? The center it's my understanding the center is going to be more like a YMCA than a mosque. It's going to have a place. It's funny that I mentioned YMCA because I was just at the Y over the weekend in Mandarin because I was considering joining. And there's a picture of Jesus Christ up on the wall, and there's some other Christian stuff on the wall. And a friend of mine said, "Why would you join the Y when you're an atheist?" And I said, "Because I like the swimming pool and, and I like the exercise room. The gymnasium has more facilities than any gym you would go join in Jacksonville. And I'm comfortable being around people who have different worldviews. And I think the time has come for the people in New York City to understand that Islam did not destroy the World Trade Centers. And there shouldn't be a problem with it. There just shouldn't be a problem with it. And I'm troubled that you're saying the wound hasn't healed yet, perhaps, and that we need to wait. And if we wait, how long?
No, it's a good point. One of my friends came up with a creative idea. I do not know if it's a workable idea or not, but it's certainly worthy of pondering over it. He said, maybe they should first build the gym and the swimming pool, and have the gym and the swimming pool be a place where everybody can gather. And maybe that will dispel some of the fears and the stereotypes. And then maybe a few years later, after it has given the community a chance to heal and create respectful dialogue, maybe then they build a mosque. Maybe that's a solution. In other words, people should be creative and try to think that my position is not, obviously I don't give in to Islamophobes because I've been writing against them for quite a while. And it has no place. Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, or racism, these are diseases. They have no place in a civilized society. And we have to be fighting against these with all our might.
Yes, all our might.
Right, but that's so. I'm not backing down from that fight. However, I feel that actually considering a creative solution to this situation would actually further the cause better. Because it is not going to, first of all, Islamophobes are not going to be satisfied with anything. I mean, whether you build a mosque 2 blocks from ground zero or 1,200 miles from ground zero, they're not happy.
Well, there's already one 4 blocks from ground zero.
Yeah, and there was a mosque inside the World Trade Center.
Well, some interesting facts. I hate to interrupt, but it's already 10 till 8. Some interesting facts that I came upon recently had to do with the World Trade Center bombing. I was reading this book about interfaith work it's a great book. I can't remember the author like you are able to remember the authors of your books that you recommend. But the World Trade Center victims came from 80 different countries, and they came from dozens of different religions. There were atheists, agnostics, Christians, Muslims, Jews, Buddhists, Sikhs, any religion you can think of, probably being the fact that it was in New York, and there's just such a variety of people there. There were just so many different people in that building that I just think that saying that we can't build that Islamic center there when Islamic people died in that building. And also Michael Bloomberg, he has his idea, and our president went along with it, that the property rights.
No, I'm not saying they can't build that Islamic center. I'm saying that they should consider if there is a better resolution to this rancor. Mm-hmm. Not because they can't. If after they have considered all of the possibilities and they still arrive at the conclusion that this may be their best option, I'm supportive of that. I'm not that I'm against them building it there. Right. No, I'm not against them.
Oh, I know you're not. I just think that the time's ripe for it to happen, not because the momentum's going to be destroyed, perhaps, and because it's just going to add weight to the Islamophobias. It's just going to make them feel like they've won, and I don't like that. We are getting probably close to Q&A unless...
Let's open it up.
You know, you've got a computer full of questions and ideas in there, and I just have one sheet of paper, so I don't know if you have anything left that you want to cover tonight as far as sharing Islam with the world and sharing your experiences, especially with the Human Rights Commission.
No,
I think we're going to have lots of great questions. I think people are going to have lots of solutions as to whether or not we should build the Islamic Center.